Good afternoon. My name is Deb Arns. I'm the Senior Museum Curator at the Nebraska State Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to our February 2006 Brown Bag Lecture Series installment. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for paying for the funding of the filming of this series, which is broadcast on public access channels in Omaha and Lincoln. Today's program is Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers, and it's being held in conjunction with the final 6-month rotation of the joint International Quilt Study Center and Nebraska State Historical Society exhibit, Patchwork Lives, which is actually going to end in April of this year. And our speaker today is Dr. Patricia Cruz. Patricia Cox Cruz is Willa Cather Professor of Textiles and Director of the International Quilt Study Center at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. The International Quilt Study Center, created under Cruz leadership, is an endowed academic center that holds the world's largest public collection of quilts, more than 1,700. Cruz was born and raised in a small town in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, but has lived in the Midwest, Kansas, and Nebraska area for more than 25 years. Her book, Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers, won the Smithsonian's Frost Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in American Crafts in 1993. Her more recent books include A Flowering of Quilts and Wild by Design, 200 Years of Innovation and Artistry in American Quilts. Wild by Design won the 2004 Textile Society of America's Shep Award for the best book in the field. Cruz and her husband David have a grown son and 3 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cruz.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for coming. Thanks for braving this snowy weather we had today. Members of the Lincoln Quilters Guild initiated the Nebraska Quilt Project in 1985, and quilters across the state joined them in photographing and recording information about Nebraska quilts. Because of their efforts, we know a great deal more today about Nebraska quilt makers and Midwestern quilt makers than we knew 20 years ago. And that's what I will be basing my talk on today, and it provides all of the information for the Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers talk. What led members of the Lincoln Quilters Guild to undertake a statewide project, an enormous project? Several factors motivated them, but the most compelling factor was their concern that many surviving 19th and early 20th century quilts were being sold out of private hands into the hands of dealers and collectors from New York to California and beyond at an astonishing rate. While the quilts remained in family hands, knowledge of the quilt's history, who the maker was, about when it was made, where it was made, was known and preserved within the family. But when it was sold out of the family's hands, most often that information was lost forever. And so, in an effort to preserve this information before additional quilts were sold out of family hands, the 20 members of the Lincoln Quilters Guild formed a Nebraska Quilt Project Committee and began to survey the state. Citizens across the state, Quilt Guild members across the state, joined in their effort. And as a result of that, nearly 5,000 quilts and 3,000 makers were eventually documented. The book that Deb mentioned that I have here in my hand, Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers, is one of the results, the culminating results of that statewide survey. And the information that we uncovered throughout that 2 to 5 year project, well, it was more than a 2-year project, throughout about a 5-year project or more, was just fascinating. And that's what I'd like to share with you briefly today. The skills for quilt making came to Nebraska The skills for quilt making came to Nebraska with her earliest settlers, and the skills have been transmitted from generation to generation ever since, usually by female relatives to female relatives, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, and so forth. And despite the hardships and endless demands on their time during the days of settlement and early development of the state, Nebraska women and a few men found time to make quilts, many quilts. Well, who were Nebraska quilt makers, we wondered. Most Nebraska quilt makers, as of course we all would have guessed, were rural women, but you don't know until you do survey the state. They lived on farms and in rural communities across the state, and prior to 1970, most were farm wives, ranch wives, or housewives. Teaching, however, was the profession that accounted for the greatest percentage of Nebraska quilt makers who did work outside the home. Teachers were in high demand on the plains between 1875 and 1900 because there were so many children to be educated. In Nebraska, for example, the number of school-aged children increased fivefold between 1870 and 1882 alone. Other occupations of early quilt makers included seamstress, milliner, secretary, housekeeper, nurse, sales clerk, really occupations typical for women of the period who were working outside the home. However, most of the quilt makers or their descendants indicated that they were ranch wives, farm wives, or housewives, as were most married women of the 19th and first half of the 20th century. Church affiliation was identified for almost 80% of Nebraska quilt makers. Glenda Riley, a noted historian of frontier women, maintains that church affiliation was vitally important to European women who helped settle the prairie and plains regions of the United States. She argues that, quote, because women, especially those in rural areas, had fewer support systems and sources of information than did men, who could relate to other men in the local shop, the livery stable, the grain elevator, and so forth, women, as a result, turned to their churches. Church affiliation continues to be important to Nebraska quilt makers, and church denominations to which most Nebraska quilt makers belonged were the same ones to which most Nebraskans belonged: Catholic, Lutheran, Methodist, and Presbyterian. The differences, though, lie in the percentages of quilt makers affiliated with each denomination. About twice as many Nebraska quilt makers identified themselves as Methodists as you would have expected based on the statewide population of Methodists. And about half as many Nebraska quilt makers identified themselves as a Catholic affiliation compared with the statewide population as a whole. The smaller percentage of Catholics among Nebraska quilt makers, we think, may be attributed to the involvement of Catholic women in their altar societies, where they did a lot of church embroidery for vestments and so forth, whereas the Methodist women were more often involved in quilt making for fundraising and mission relief purposes. Well, that provides a brief overview of some of the demographic information about Nebraska quilt makers that we uncovered in the survey. But of even greater importance, or interest rather, are some of the stories of the individual quilt makers and the quilts they made. And their stories really do shed light on the lives of women from the mid-1850s to the mid-1950s. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I'd like to share a few of their stories with you. And now if someone would turn out, well, no, you don't need to turn out the lights. That's right, I just need to advance the slides. The oldest surviving quilt known to have been made by a Nebraskan is an applique quilt completed by Martha Alice, pictured here, in 1860. And now her quilt is a part of this Museum of Nebraska History holdings. Martha was born in the Missouri River settlement of Bellevue, Nebraska, or really it was Bellevue, Nebraska Territory in 1840. Her parents were among the earliest European settlers to the state. They were Presbyterian missionaries to the Pawnee Indians. Martha's parents actually arrived before Nebraska became one of the United States. They arrived when we were still Nebraska Territory. As you know, Nebraska didn't gain her statehood until 1867, 7 years after Martha made this quilt. Her quilt is a variation of the pattern called Wreath of Roses. It's one of the red and green applique quilts that were a favored quilt style in America between the 1840s and 1870s. Applique quilts are much more challenging and time-consuming to make than pieced block-style quilts, but a number of women like Martha Alice chose to make one of these. Martha's applique quilt shows that frontier families secured fashionable fabrics from traders, even when they lived in remote western territories, and that they made quilts just like those being made by their sisters across the United States during the same period. Although Martha's quilt was made in Nebraska in 1860, few other Nebraska-made quilts were found that were believed to have been made before 1870. Most surviving Nebraska quilts documented in the statewide survey were made between 1890 and 1940, or they were made after 1970, because we did register contemporary quilts made from 1970 until the end of the survey in the early 90s. It's not surprising that most would have been made after the 1890s in Nebraska, because it was during the 1870s and 1880s when most of the European settlers arrived in Nebraska. So naturally, most quilts would have been made after that time. Many of the quilt makers and their parents came to Nebraska following the Civil War, when a wave of Civil War veterans came west to seek land and fortune. This wave of migration populated the remaining western territories, as depicted in this quilt, this contemporary quilt made by Paulette Peters of Elkhorn, Nebraska. While many of the settlers were homesteaders, like the ones pictured here in this quilt called The Promise, many more purchased land from railroads. The railroads mounted an advertising campaign in the eastern United States and throughout Europe during the 1870s that would rival sophisticated advertising and promotional efforts today. They produced pamphlets touting Nebraska as a place rich with, quote, the promise of agricultural rewards, and hence the title for this quilt. Traveling exhibits and promotional lectures followed to reinforce the image. The promotional effort was hugely successful, as we know. Large settlements of Germans, English, Swedes, Danes, and Czechs formed colonies and purchased railroad land in Nebraska as a result of this hugely successful promotional effort by the railroad. Most Nebraska quilt makers were German, followed by English, Czech, Irish, Scotch, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian. One aspect of Nebraska's quilt making practices that was particularly striking to me was that quilt making was a lifelong activity, and the hardships of relocation and settlement didn't interrupt these women's quilt making activities for long, if at all. For example, Sophia Heinrichs and her daughter Helena made a quilt while living under some of the most unfavorable conditions during homesteading years that I can imagine. They pieced this fan quilt while living in a dugout, which remained their home for more than 5 years. Can you imagine making a quilt while struggling to make a home under these conditions? Or these? Sitting a homestead claim in the sandhills of northwestern Nebraska seems like an unlikely setting for stitching any quilt, much less a lavish silk crazy quilt. But according to her memoirs, Clarissa Palmer Griswold stitched this quilt from a variety of silk fabrics sent to her by her family, which remained in Minnesota. In her memoirs, Clarissa recalls how in her youth her imagination was fired by stories of young people finding their fortunes in the West and of girlfriends homesteading together in a cabin built on adjoining claims. In 1885, Clarissa lived out this dream. A friend invited her to visit her home in Ainsworth to see the West and get this, to recover her health after 3 years of teaching elementary school. Clarissa arrived in September of 1885. Hearing of land and opportunities further west, she went to Valentine. In October, she staked a claim, sight unseen, near what was to become Harrison, Nebraska. After wintering in Denver with an uncle, Clarissa made a journey back to Nebraska by train, stagecoach, and wagon, chaperoned, according to her memoirs, only by her revolver. She had a log cabin built for her, very rare in Nebraska, but as a relatively well-to-do single woman, Clarissa was able to buy supplies and to hire some of the necessary work to be done, including having a log cabin built. Clarissa's life was very different from that of most homesteading women. With no livestock or family to tend, she had time to paint flowers on her silk patches and to make the crazy quilt that you saw. Incidentally, Clarissa married Dwight Griswold, whom she had met at her friend's home when she first came to Nebraska. The second of their 3 children, Dwight Griswold Jr., later became governor of Nebraska and a United States senator. Her quilt, and here's a detail, is now a part of the Museum of Nebraska History's collection here as well. While the homesteading circumstances of these women provide some sharp contrasts, nevertheless, the making of both of these quilts illustrate how quickly women resumed their quilt making activities after their move to new homes and to a life that was certainly new, different, and by no means easy. Well, what motivated women to devote so many spare moments to quilt making, even under the most adverse circumstances? The majority of Nebraska quilt makers indicated that they began quilt making because it was a pastime that they enjoyed. It allowed them to escape the rigors and the drabness of their everyday life and enter a world of color and create something of beauty for their home and family. Although some quilt making was certainly done to provide warm bedding during hard times, a lot of quilt making was done for the sheer pleasure and joy of creating an object of beauty. Some quilts, like this applique quilt, are so complex and the needlework so fine that it's clear that the quilt maker didn't hastily assemble this to provide warm bedding. The number of hours required to complete this exquisite medallion-style floral applique quilt is really beyond reckoning today. There are more than 800 tiny, near-perfect red circles alone, as well as all the yellow circles, the countless leaves, and the yards and yards of that slender trailing vine. Marie Louise Sir started this quilt in 1894 and completed it during the first year of her marriage. She spent most of her life on a farm near Staplehurst, where she and her husband raised 12 children, 4 of whom were born in the first 5 years of marriage. So it's a good thing she finished this quilt before the first one came along. Another quilt that stands as powerful evidence that women derive great personal satisfaction from creating beautiful quilts and showing off their exceptional needlework skills is Grace Snyder's quilt called Flower Basket Petty Point. While it doesn't hold the world's record for the most pieces, it comes close. It boasts more than 87,000 pieces. And the pieces, I think I have another close-up, the pieces are smaller than a postage stamp, approximately a 1/2 inch to 5/8 of an inch square, and many of them are cut into a triangle. You can see this quilt upstairs. It's part of the Museum of Nebraska History's holdings, and if you want a glimpse of it, go upstairs at the conclusion of the talk today, and you can actually get a glimpse of it. Grace Snyder, author of the familiar autobiography, No Time on My Hands, devoted 16 months to making this quilt during World War II. It was the Purple Sweepstakes winner at the Nebraska State Fair in 1944. Grace Snyder's quilts and others like them, for example, this stunning Mariner's Compass, illustrate that quilt making was certainly not undertaken simply to meet family needs. Of course, pioneer values of resourcefulness and industriousness motivated women to devote their free time to quilt making and to other forms of needlework, but necessity was clearly not their only or even their primary motivation for making these quilts. Another example of impressive quilt making skills is this star quilt. Perhaps the remarkable amount of time devoted to quilt making by rural American women during the 19th and 20th centuries, and now the 21st centuries, is better explained by the limited opportunities for artistic expression available to rural American women and men, especially those settling the frontier. Painting, sculpture, and other fine arts were regarded as just far too frivolous for rural women or men to undertake. On the other hand, quilt making, which produced a useful item for their families, afforded women an acceptable avenue for their creativity. From the numbers of outstanding quilts that have survived, it's clear that many, many women seized that opportunity and exercised this option. But they had other reasons for quilt making as well. Some women found quilt making therapeutic. Ellen Maxwell made this crazy quilt to overcome grief following the death of her baby daughter from a diphtheria epidemic during the winter of 1892. Her husband became so concerned about her mental and emotional health after the death of their baby that he went to a neighboring elderly couple and just said, you know, could you suggest anything that will make her want to go on living? And they, the woman suggested that that she come and help his wife begin a crazy quilt, which she did. And she completed this, and according to family accounts, then she folded it up and put it away and never used it, which is the reason it's in pristine condition today. But she was able to go on with her life after that. It did help her recover. Special occasions such as birthdays, graduations, marriages, and births prompted a great deal of quilt making in all periods. Rachel Armstrong Chase made this handsome quilt of indigo blue cottons in 1874 for the dowry of her daughter, Sarah Parrott. The Parrotts were early settlers of Albion, Nebraska. And this striking crazy quilt was made in Creighton, Nebraska by a mother for her son's 12th birthday. We know this because the inscription in pink and green embroidery reads, "A present to Ernest on his 12th birthday, 1899, Mama." Pictured here, the mother was a well-regarded dressmaker living in Creighton, Nebraska, And this quilt survives because poor little Ernest was killed in a mining accident in Colorado at 21, and so this quilt was really treasured and saved by the family. This quilt with an applique message was a going away gift for a young man. That's a little low on the screen, but I think you can see the top part. It was a going away gift for William Hutchison, who was leaving his home in West Virginia for unknown Nebraska in 1882. Quilts with messages are very rare, and fewer still carry a message of such length. And this one is incredibly cautionary. It reads in part, "Attend, young friend, while I relate the dangers you are in, the evils that around you wait while subject unto sin. Turn to the Lord and forsake all sin, and he'll forgive what's past." Well, we don't know what all she might have been thinking or all of the worries she had, but here is a photograph of the young man with his bride on their wedding day. He did move to Nebraska. He did survive and thrive here despite her concerns. And he had been raised by his grandmother, and you can imagine the hard time for any parent or grandparent to send off a young son or grandson to the West in that period, and knowing that you might never see them again. Members of the Lady Eighth Society of the Wahoo Presbyterian Church made this quilt to raise money for their minister's salary. They charged their friends, family members, and neighbors 10 cents for the right to have their name embroidered on a block. And then they sold the quilt at auction. Many of the early settlers of the Wahoo area have their signatures among the 300 names embroidered in those radiating spokes that really do suggest wagon wheels. Among the names was that of a young lawyer and magnetic orator from Lincoln, who had spoken at different functions in Wahoo on a number of occasions. Apparently he was asked to buy a right to have his name on the quilt, for Colonel William Jennings Bryan and Mrs. Bryan both did so. Can you spot their signatures? Also included is one wheel where all the names are Native American, including Wallace Whitehorse and Les Yellowfish. Were they members of the congregation? Were they friends of the pastor? Were they just friends of one of the quilt makers? We'll never know, but it documents the participation of both settlers and Native Americans in this quilt making and fundraising tradition. So, as you can see, for a variety of reasons and for a variety of occasions, women made many quilts. But we also wondered, when and how did they learn to quilt? We found out that some women learned to make quilts as children, because in rural households, children as well as adolescents were expected to participate in the household work of their families. Young girls of the 19th and early 20th century were much more likely to learn needlework skills as a way to prepare for their future than our children are today. Many Nebraska quilt makers related stories about their childhood experiences in quilt making, some positive and some not so positive. But Belle Frazier of Parks, Nebraska, the youngest quilt maker registered in the statewide survey, started this quilt when she was just 3.5 years old. She finished it when she was 6, or I should say she finished the blocks for the top and her mother assembled it. You'll be maybe a little bit relieved to know she didn't do the whole thing by 6. It was a simple 4-patch, quote, just little squares. My mother would cut them out and pin them together and mark where I was supposed to sew. And a number of the young quilt makers would mention that they had to sew a stint, so many squares together before they could go out and play or this sort of thing. While some quilt makers were like Belle and began to quilt as children under their mother's close supervision, the majority of Nebraska quilt makers in all periods began to make quilts as young adults. Many young women made their first quilts for their dowries, as did Helen Ulrich Chalupnik, the 14-year-old girl who made this quilt. Another question that was of interest to us was, Did most Nebraska quilt makers quilt in a group or alone? We found that nearly 2/3 of the quilts registered were quilted by the quilt maker herself, rather than by someone else or in quilting bees. A number of the quilt makers indicated that they didn't want careless hands to spoil their prized work, and so they quilted their prized heirloom quilts themselves. And of course, most of the quilts registered in this survey were among the prized quilts of the family, and the ones quilted in groups for mission and relief purposes and perhaps utility uses were more likely to have been used up and not saved or not brought in and recorded in this survey. But we did discover that most Nebraska quilt makers didn't quilt their quilts at the quilting bee so often pictured in novels and movies or paintings such as this for the reasons I just mentioned. We suspect that the quilts that were quilted at quilting bees were made for mission and relief purposes. This special quilt, however, was made by a group, 44 friends and relatives, all members of the Thimble Club of Cairo, Nebraska. They helped Rosemary Seek make this friendship crazy quilt for her mother. The 15-year-old daughter embroidered the center block inscription that reads, "Presented to Mama, the 21st of September, 1910. What a birthday present, or what a present for whatever the reason it was on that date. In conclusion, quilt making in Nebraska was a practice of thriftiness, a respected feminine pastime, and an enduring form of self-expression. Nebraskans prided themselves in their industriousness, their frugalness, and their resourcefulness, and these values are clearly reflected in their quilt making. Although quilt making was no longer a fashionable activity for urban American women by the late 19th century, it remained a popular activity in Nebraska until the 1950s, because most Nebraskans continued to live on farms and in small rural farm communities where traditional values continued to dominate family life. Well, that concludes this brief look back at a century of quilts in women's lives. And if you would like to read more of their stories, do, as Deb Ahrens suggested, pick up a copy of this book, Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers. If you don't own one, you can pick it up in their bookstore or bookstores across the state, or it's available in every public library in the state of Nebraska, because the Nebraska State Quilters Guild, which buys one book for a public library every year and gives it to every library in the state, they chose this book one year and gave it to every public library in the state, which is another indication of the grassroots support of quilt making in this state. Incidentally, in closing, let me acknowledge that one of the major reasons we now have the International Quilt Study Center at the University of Nebraska, and soon we'll have a quilt museum in Lincoln, Nebraska, is that Artis and Robert James, our benefactors, were impressed by Nebraska's strong grassroots support for what they envisioned for a quilt study center. They knew that Nebraska had such a strong quilt making tradition and had to have a group of dedicated quilters to conduct such a successful statewide documentation project, culminating in a book such as Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers. So thank you. And now I can take a few questions, I believe. Are there any questions?
In that one illustration of the quilting bee, it looked like there was a guy sitting at the table. Was that ever done?
I'm sure it was. And in fact, there are a few male quilt makers pictured in Nebraska Quilts and Quiltmakers from the 1890s. The question was, in this slide, there is one man pictured seated, and she wondered if that ever happened. Generally, the men came at the end of the day for the potluck supper and the dancing that would go on at the quilting frolic, as they often called them in the 19th century. But it does suggest, you know, they have him sitting here. I don't doubt that there were ever some men who did it, and like I said, I'm sure I can't turn to the one here, but there was one very distinguished looking gentleman who made one of the quilts pictured in here, as well as in the 19th century, and Ernest Tate, an engineering graduate of UNL, who made a number of quilts in the 20th century. Other questions? Yes.
Would you tell us about any of your own quilting? Do you work in a more modern style, or do you prefer reproducing the traditional quilts?
You know, I'm a historian and a teacher, not a quilter. I was raised in a rural community, as you heard, in the Shenandoah Valley. My mother was a very skilled seamstress, and I did piece a block or two as a child. My mother made her first quilt when she started it when she was 13, and like young Belle Frazier of Parks, Nebraska, her mother finished her top as well. And so I too, when I reached 13, was inspired by, you know, having slept under and hearing about it, and started my grandmother's flower garden quilt block. But I made many more. I made clothes, but I've never made a complete quilt. So I can't answer your question at all about my quilt making activities. But I certainly have the needlework skills to be able to understand and appreciate. I do think that it's very important to understand the process so that you can fully appreciate what you're seeing, and I think I have enough skills to do that. Other questions? The completion date is fall of 2007. Groundbreaking is expected to begin at the 33rd and Holdridge site in April or May of this year, and it will be completed in about a year after that. Then once it's completed, we don't know whether it will be into the summer or fall of 2007, it will take a few months, obviously, to move all of the collection over and to move ourselves over and to mount the first exhibition. So we might open it up for some building tours in the fall upon completion, but it would probably be December, January, February before we can welcome visitors to see the first exhibition. Yes?
What size of needles did they use back then when they were sewing such small pieces together?
That's a very good question. You know, I was at Sturbridge Village last fall, and a wonderful thing that they have there is a general store. So I said, could I see a package of needles and pins, just wondering how much they would look like or how different they might look. They just looked very much like, by the 19th century, they had needles that looked much like ours do today, and in the variety of sizes. They were much more careful with them than we are today, I think, but and I was amazed. I think I even asked, what would that package of needles cost, and then how could we compare it? I was rather surprised that while they were expensive, they were not astonishingly expensive. It wasn't like $2 a needle or some such thing. I don't recall the specifics now, but I did think, well, you could appreciate why they would be careful, but they weren't astronomically priced in relationship to other goods. Yes?
I'd be interested to know, when you went around and gathered information for the book, did they just go into small communities and just start asking questions, or what method was used?
There were a group of 20-some women that formed a committee to do the Nebraska Quilt Project. And they sought advice from John Carter here at the Historical Society, from Ron Nagel of Nebraska Wesleyan on fashioning the survey instrument that would record the information. And then and I was also brought into the project to help design the questions related to fabrication and fabrics used in the quilts and the construction and that sort of thing. And then they drew upon surveys, statewide survey questionnaire and survey forms that had been developed in other states at that point, though Nebraska was fairly early on. This grassroots movement to document quilts state by state across the United States didn't start until the 1980s. And by '86, the Nebraska Quilt Project Committee was formed and underway. So that's how the questionnaire, the survey was completed, and the 20 women who went to some of them went to every single site. And they would examine the quilt and record information about every quilt. And on another instrument at another table, individuals, either the maker herself or a descendant of the maker, would respond to the questions that were asked on that about the maker and about religious church affiliation, occupation, where they lived, and that sort of thing. And so that's how the survey instruments were developed, and then how the survey was recorded. They with the help of Professor Nagel, they identified what we thought would be a representative sample of the various ethnic groups across the state, because when we started, we wondered if there might not be some ethnic differences. Ultimately, no, you couldn't tell a Czech quilt from a quilt made by an English or German maker. But we didn't know that, so we did purposefully try to select communities that would reflect that ethnic diversity across the state. And then we tried to secure geographic representation. So there were 20-some sites, and before the group went to each site, they would identify their project director, who was Frankie Best, would identify someone in the community who was very good at organizing efforts and promoting events, often with the advice and recommendation of the cooperative extension agent, county extension agent in that county. And so they would identify someone in that way. It was that local community's responsibility to find a venue that could be used for people to bring their quilts in, to be photographed, and for all of this information to be recorded. And then they would be responsible for publicizing it as well. And in western Nebraska, this was really quite an event, and we sometimes had more people show up in the western Nebraska venues than we would in Lincoln and Omaha, because they would come from miles around. One day there were more than 300 quilts brought to one site, which was just an overwhelming number. And but that in a nutshell tells you how they went about doing this and crafting the survey and collecting the data. So they really became trained paraprofessionals that went out in the state to collect the data. And a National Endowment for the Arts, folk arts group grant helped support the survey. Then the Woods Foundation, the Cooper Foundation, and several others helped support the publication of the book eventually. So they really did get support federally and statewide, as well as locally from the guilds and the communities.
Are there
Yes.
any members here today?
There are some members here today, and that's a very good, thank you for suggesting that. Would those of you who were members of the Nebraska Quilt Project Committee stand? I see Mary Gormley and Mona Jean Easter. And who else is here? And there are some members of the Lincoln Quilters Guild who are here as well, who really supported this whole effort, and financially and with moral support as well. And with the Lincoln Quilt Guild members who are here, please stand up. Come on. So, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
I know that some of the quilts during the 40s and 30s and 40s were made of feed sack. And do they last and look as nice as the ones upstairs that are really old?
Actually, most of them do, because, you know, there were some really cheap feed sack, flour sacks, sugar sacks made, but there were others that are really sometimes difficult to distinguish from other print cloths of the period, and they do. In fact, the one on the cover, well, I'm not certain this one is feed sack or flour sack, but the pieces here, they look similar to some of those prints, and there are other quilts inside that definitely we've identified were made from the sugar sacks and flour sacks and feed sacks. So yes, the ones made from feed sacks and flour sacks do survive, as well as the ones made from the other fabrics made expressly for clothing. There was another question here.
Did you find a lot of African American or Native American quilters out there?
The question is, did we find a lot of Native American and African American quilts? We specifically, we hosted one quilt project day at the Malone Center in Lincoln, and really promoted it heavily in the African American churches here locally, but our turnout was disappointingly small, and so no, we didn't record many. And we knew that we could not go to the Indian reservations in northeastern Nebraska and use the same approach that we had for this, that you couldn't advertise something and they would not follow that model. And we didn't secure the additional funding that it would have taken to do individually going out. We discussed it. It was certainly thought of, but the cost of trying to add that on was something we were unable to financially support.
We have the outstanding examples of quilting history in your book, and I was just wondering, there must be lots of other data that was assembled during that project. Where is it stored?
Thank you for asking that question. The question was, first of all, an observation, there must have been a lot more information than is recorded in this book, and where is the information that was collected in the statewide survey stored? It's stored in two places. One is at the Nebraska State Historical Society archives, so that the public has access to it there, and the other place is at the University of Nebraska Lincoln's Love Library and Special Collections has a second set. Nebraska Quilt Project Committee was really committed to preserving the information once it was gathered and to seeing that it was shared with the public. So they made not one but two copies of every slide. And incidentally, the slides, many of the photographs that you saw were some of the actual field slides that were taken. Some of them were later professionally photographed, but some were the field work. And so all of those slides are there, as are all of the completed surveys. And many times the families went home and completed additional information, genealogical information about their family and about the maker, and sent it in, returned it at a later date for us, and those too are filed with the records. So it is a rich record, and now the Nebraska Quilt Project records are being ingested into an electronic index in a nationwide effort as a part of the Quilt Alliance and Michigan State University, so that there really a big effort is being made to establish a model whereby the records collected in every state can be brought into one database so that we can search and learn more than we can by just knowing or searching an individual state's records. We can better have a better idea of the similarities and differences across the United States in quilt making traditions. And so probably as we speak, some of Nebraska's records are being ingested. And later this year or early next, this index, quilt index, will become, well, it's already available online, but Nebraska Quilt Project records will be added to that so that even more people will have access to them. So thanks for asking that question. Rosalind?
Speaking of online and things like that, are the quilts that are in the International Quilt Study Center, are they online, and how many of them? And
thank you for asking that question. The International Quilt Study Center's collection is online. There are more than 1,800 quilts in the collection now. Not all of them. The latest acquisitions are not online, and so we do have a searchable database that featuring our quilts that includes an image of every quilt, and we have averaged 300 to 400,000 hits per month on our website. The first month when we announced that we had our searchable database available, there were more than 650,000 hits that month. So the public has definitely responded with interest, and we're really pleased to be able to provide access to our collections in that way. Connie?
Well, I know somebody that's in that book, and she's here today.
Oh. Oh, yes, that's right. That was a question we didn't ask. And actually, you know two people who are featured in the book today, Mary Gormley. We have one chapter in the book that features our contemporary quilt makers of the state, some of the outstanding, the leaders of the state. And in fact, there you can see the promise. And am I before or after yours? I don't know. I just passed it. But yes, we have another, Sandy Anderson is here. And one more? This way. This way? There. One of the most beloved quilt patterns in the book, three-way cats. And we have a chapter called Nebraska Treasures that features Grace Snyder's quilts, Mary Gormley's quilts, and one of our male quilt makers, Ernest Haight, who wrote a book about machine quilting in the 50s or 60s, fairly early on, 60s or 70s. And here are some of Ernest Haight's quilts. So thank you for mentioning that, Connie, that we have some actual makers here today who are featured in the book. And that concludes the program at the Museum of Nebraska History's Brown Bag Series today. Thank you.